Hey y'all, it's Miss Osborne, and today we're going to be looking at the Russian Revolution and the end of World War I. The war and the social unrest had really pushed Russia to the edge of a revolution and kind of led into Russia's exit from World War I and also became a turning point in history. We're also going to look at the end of World War I and how the entry of the United States into the conflict led to peace. The essential questions that we'll be addressing in this video are: what events led to the Russian Revolution? And then what were the social, economic, and physical costs of the war? Goldnock historians will analyze the causes and effects of the Russian Revolution and evaluate the extent to which the United States joining the Allied powers was a turning point for World War I. While you're watching, make sure that you're taking good notes in either Cornell or Outline format as we talked about in class. It's okay if you need to pause or rewind the video to make sure that you're taking good notes. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia had promised change after the Revolution of 1905, kind of the turning point where all these other revolutions were happening. But there was little change ever seen. A small Marxist group known as the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, wanted to overthrow the Tsar and believed that the people should be the ones to gain power over Russia, and Lenin wanted to install a socialist government. The Bolsheviks, however, didn't want just the people to rule. They wanted an elite group to lead the revolution and then keep the power over Russia. Tsar Nicholas had really hoped that the war would stir up some patriotic feelings and help to unite the country, but the factories weren't able to produce enough military supplies, and the military wasn't prepared to fight. They were losing lots of battles, and then there was a lot of famine going on and a lot of hunger and poverty overall, and so the Russian people weren't very happy with his leadership. On March 8 of 1917, Russian citizens took to the streets of Petrograd, the Russian capital, to protest the lack of food and fuel. Tsar Nicholas II ordered the legislature to disband, but they refused. The people, the military, and the legislature overall refused to listen to the Tsar, and so it was pretty clear his monarchy was over. The Duma, or the Russian legislature, put a provisional government into place, but the Russian people didn't feel like it was doing enough to meet their needs, and they continued to support the Bolsheviks, who were leading an opposition to the provisional government. The October Revolution was led by the Bolshevik Red Guard, armed factory workers, against the provisional government. Once in power, Lenin established a communist government that made private ownership of land illegal and took control of Russia's factory system, bringing them under government control as well. After the revolution, Lenin ended Russia's involvement in World War I, but there was really harsh terms of surrender, since he had to give up a very large chunk of the empire, mainly Eastern European countries that had been a part of their overall empire. The acceptance of these terms upset a lot of Russians, and an opposition movement to the Bolsheviks called the White Army formed. The Whites were mainly made up of army leaders, politicians, and wealthy Russians, and they received some help from Bolsheviks' enemies like the United States and France, who had predominantly a democracy and a capitalist government and believed that communism was the enemy. Millions of Russians died in the civil war between the Reds and the Whites before the Bolsheviks finally triumphed in 1920 and the years following World War I. As a result of the Civil War, many Russians were poor and suffering. Lenin tried to win back the favor of the people through his new economic policy that allowed some capitalist activities, such as selling food for a profit, trying to encourage more food production to feed the people. In 1922, after World War I, Russia joined with several neighboring lands that had previously been a part of the Russian Empire in Eastern Europe. These new countries formed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, otherwise known as what we know today, the Soviet Union. Now, the United States had pretty much remained neutral during World War I overall, but that wasn't really easy when Germany kept attacking ships that held American passengers. The American people weren't too excited about the fact that the Americans were dying at the hands of World War I. The German U-boats, which were essentially submarines, were attacking ships that carried American passengers under the policy of unrestricted submarine warfare that essentially stated that Germany would attack any ship traveling in the waters toward Great Britain, their enemy. The sinking of the Lusitania killed approximately 1,200 people, including 120 Americans, and this was kind of the last straw. America had been complaining to Germany, urging them not to sink any more ships, and Germany was like, yeah, sure, we will. But it was really difficult for them not to do that when Great Britain was still their enemy. The last straw for the Americans was the Zimmermann Note, a note from German diplomat Arthur Zimmermann to officials in Mexico. It was discovered and had proposed that Mexico attack the United States, and in return, at the end of the war, Germany would give Mexico back the territory that had been lost in a prior conflict with the United States. In April 17, the United States ended up joining the Allied powers, who they felt was more their allies, Great Britain and France. Germany knew that the United States joining the Allied powers could lead to a quick win for them, and that they would have to act fast before the United States could mobilize. With Russia out of the war, Germany was now able to focus primarily on the Western Front in France, and was able to push all the way until they got about 40 miles outside of Paris. At the Second Battle of the Marne, the Allied forces, joined by the United States, were finally able to push the Germans back and switch to the offensive. In October of 1917, the Allied forces were able to push through the German lines and convince the Germans to accept an armistice, or where they would agree to a truce. This essentially ended World War I, as many of the other Central Powers had pretty much given up by now. Now, peace wasn't very easy. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, had already announced his plan for peace called the 14 Points. The first 4 points called for open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, removal of trade barricades, and reduction of military arms, attempting to get rid of some of the things that caused World War I, such as militarism. The 5th point proposed a system to resolve disputes over colonies. This was hoping to get help with imperialism. And then points 16 through 13 dealt with self-determination, or the right of people to decide their own political status. This was in support of democracy worldwide and hoping to spread those democratic ideals to other countries as they created their own countries and separated from other countries. The 14th point called for the establishment of a League of Nations, and this was an organization kind of like the United Nations that would work together to solve disputes, protect democracy, and try to prevent future wars. All of the 4 powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy, met in Paris to try to negotiate a peace. Germany and the Central Powers, such as Russia, were not invited to participate. Every nation came to the conference with different needs and different expectations, hoping to get something out of it. The nations ended up drawing up the Treaty of Versailles that led to military changes, territory changes, war guilt in the League of Nations. The military changes were that they forced Germany to disarm their military, limited the size of the army, and banned them from having an air force. The territory changes was that Germany was going to be required to give a bunch of land to France and other nations, and also give control of their colonies to the League of Nations. Other new countries and colonies formed in Europe and the Middle East, such as a Palestinian state in the Middle East for Jews, and then Yugoslavia and other Eastern European countries also formed. The war guilt provision said that Germany was the #1 power responsible for all of the damage to the Allied nations, and as a responsible party, they then had to also pay reparations, which were essentially like fees, to the Allied nations. They just kind of finished paying off those reparations about 5 or 6 years ago. Then last thing is that the Treaty of Versailles established the League of Nations overall. Now, the effects of the war were long-lasting. Politically, we saw the overthrow of all the monarchies in European countries. We also saw the rise of the Bolsheviks, or a communist government in Russia. Germany, which had previously been a major European power, was greatly weakened. Other countries and colonies formed in Europe and the Middle East, and then the European colonies in Africa and Asia began changing hands, and the balance of power there shifted. Economically, the world cost the world $332 billion, which was ridiculous. And then farmland and cities were just devastated, which meant that there was a lot of European countries that entered into a famine. Overall, human cost was that 8.5 million soldiers died. Almost an entire generation of young men died in the towns. 13 million civilians died, and 21.2 million soldiers were wounded overall. Make sure that you read back over your notes and that you have all the necessary vocabulary. Thanks for joining me for this video, and we'll see you in class.